Title: Echoes of the Void. Chapter 1: The Signal from the Abyss. The hum of Astra 7 was constant, a mechanical lullaby for the tired, the stressed, the disconnected. Yet in the silence of space, where only the stars should exist, something else lingered. A whisper, faint, fleeting, but persistent. It was the kind of sound that burrowed its way into the psyche, becoming an itch that couldn't be scratched, a nagging thought that crept into the minds of those who dared to listen. Dr. Elena Vostrikov had been working late. Long past the other members of the crew had retired to their quarters. The soft glow of the control panels illuminated her weary face, casting a stark contrast to the cold black void outside. Her eyes scanned the data, scrolling through streams of celestial information, the positions of distant stars, the gravitational anomalies of nearby asteroids, the low-frequency pulses of cosmic radiation. But then, amid the usual patterns, there was something new. A signal, faint but unmistakable, cutting through the static like a blade. It had been a while since anything out of the ordinary had been picked up. But this was different. Eleanor felt the hairs on the back of her neck prickle, not from fear, but from a feeling deeper than instinct. Something wrong. She turned to her workstation, where the distorted frequencies of the signal were being processed. As the initial data came in, she noted something even more strange. The signal had a rhythmic pattern, a repetition, almost like words. The transmission was broken, fragmented by the distance and static, but she was certain this was no ordinary cosmic noise. The last time something similar happened, it had been a false alarm, an interference from a malfunctioning satellite. But this time, the signal felt deliberate. It beckoned her, drawing her in like an unknown voice in the night. The voice seemed to be speaking in Russian. "God, help me. Please. Somebody. Help." Eleanor leaned closer to the monitor, the words seeping into her thoughts as if they were pulling at the edges of her consciousness. She froze for a moment, a chill running down her spine. The voice was desperate, pleading. It was a distress call, that much was clear. But from where? From whom? She immediately alerted Commander Ivanov, the leader of Astra 7. His presence on the bridge was commanding, his manner always calm and calculated, but Elena couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, that something was off in the air. A shift she couldn't explain. "Commander." Eleanor's voice trembled slightly as she spoke, despite her attempts to keep it steady. "I've intercepted a signal. It's faint, but it's definitely a human voice. And I believe it's coming from deep in the uncharted region of the Kestrel Nebula." Ivanov raised an eyebrow, his eyes narrowing in thought. "A distress signal?" he asked, though the skepticism in his tone was palpable. "From where? There's nothing out there. Nothing for thousands of light years." Elena shook her head. "That's what I thought. But the signal's there, and it's real." "Are you sure it's not interference?" "I've checked. It's too coherent for random noise. It's a pattern, almost like a message, and it's repeating every few minutes. It's clear." Ivanov stood up, walking over to her workstation. The flickering image on the monitor showed only a few broken words. "Please help," followed by static. A moment of silence passed before the next burst came through, an incoherent murmur, then another. The signal was growing clearer with each attempt, but the words still made little sense. "What's the next step?" Ivanov asked. Elena hesitated. "We need to pinpoint its origin. If it's a distress signal, it's crucial we act. It could be from a lost spacecraft or a trap," Ivanov finished for her. "A message from something else." She knew he was referring to the rumors, the whispers that had circulated through the scientific community. Unexplained disappearances of spacecraft in the farthest reaches of space. Alien encounters, potential hostile intelligence, or worse. But the thought of it, something other than humanity's own probes and satellites stretching out into the void, seemed impossible. The universe was so vast, so cold, so empty. What could possibly exist out there? The station's systems hummed louder as the crew worked to triangulate the signal's origin. Eleanor and Ivanov spent hours analyzing the data, cross-referencing it with any known deep space missions. There was nothing. No records of any spacecraft in that region of space for at least 100 years. Yet, the signal persisted. Maybe it's an anomaly, Ivanov said, but even he didn't sound convinced. Elena glanced at the coordinates on the display. The location was impossibly far, almost on the edge of the known universe, near a dark area in space where not even the best telescopes had been able to penetrate. There was nothing out there. Nothing. As the hours passed, the signal grew stronger. It wasn't just a whisper anymore. It was a cry for help, raw, desperate, and filled with terror. Elena was unable to shake the sense that the voice was familiar, though she couldn't place why. Her mind raced, reviewing the fragments of the transmission. "Please, help," it repeated, over and over, becoming more and more urgent. Then, there was a moment of silence. The signal stopped, leaving only a deep, hollow hum that filled the room. "Did it stop?" Ivanov asked. He stared at the screen, unsure whether to feel relief or dread. "Just a pause," Elena replied, her voice steady. But even she wasn't certain. A strange unease settled in her stomach. They sat in silence, waiting for the signal to return. And then, as if in response to their unspoken fears, it came again. This time, it was different. The voice was unmistakably human, but the words were distorted. It was no longer a plea. It was an invitation. "You have to come. It's waiting." Elena's breath caught in her throat. Ivanov turned to her. "What the hell was that?" I don't know," Elena whispered. Her heart pounded in her chest, and for the first time in years, she felt the weight of the void pressing against her. "It's asking us to come. But where?" There was no response. The voice was gone again, replaced by an eerie silence. The hum of the station filled the gap, but now it sounded more like a warning than a comfort. "Are we really going to follow it?" Ivanov asked, though his voice held no certainty. His eyes, usually so confident and unyielding, now betrayed a flicker of doubt. Elena looked out the observation window, staring at the distant stars. The cold, empty blackness of space stretched before her, vast and incomprehensible. And somewhere in that void, a presence waited. It had called out to them. "Yes," she whispered, almost to herself. "We have to." Chapter 1. The Signal from the Abyss, Part 2. The room felt heavier now, as though the walls of the observation deck were slowly inching inward. Elena sat back in her chair, her fingers hovering over the console, unsure of what to do next. The deep space hum of Astra 7 was still the only sound in the room, but it no longer felt comforting. In the void of space, the silence was no longer a vacuum of stillness. It felt like a waiting predator, patient, watching, circling. "Did you get the coordinates?" Ivanov asked, his voice a steady anchor in the mounting tension. He had moved away from Elena's workstation, pacing across the room as he tried to calculate their next move. His boots clicked against the metal floor, a rhythmic sound that only seemed to deepen the growing unease. "Yes," Elena said, her voice barely above a whisper. She finally found the courage to push the transmit button on the console. The system sent the coordinates to the central database, compiling the data for the rest of the crew to analyze. The signal had clearly come from the outskirts of the Kestrel Nebula, far beyond any known human exploration routes, deeper into space than even the advanced probes had ventured. But it wasn't just the location that unsettled Elena. It was the message, the voice, pleading, then inviting, as if it knew they were listening, as if it wanted them to come. "What are we even doing?" Ivanov muttered under his breath. He stopped pacing and looked at her, his eyes tired but sharp. "We don't even know what this is, Elena. It could be some kind of trap, some kind of trick." The word trap hung in the air, as if it were a physical thing, a solid presence. "I don't know," she replied, her gaze drifting back to the flashing signal on her screen. The rhythmic bursts of static had started again, but now there was something distinctly different about them. It was almost like a pattern of breathing, a pulse, like the very universe itself was inhaling and exhaling. A cold shiver ran down her spine. "I know it's risky," Elena continued, But whatever it is, we can't just ignore it. Someone might be out there. Someone human. What if they're in trouble? Dying out there. Stranded in the cold dark. Ivanov sighed, rubbing his forehead. I can't ignore that either. But I'm not sure what we're dealing with. A distress signal from a lost crew, fine. But from that region of space, it could be 100 years old. Or older. I understand, Elena said, shaking her head. But this felt too real. Too urgent. The room was growing colder. The faint lights above flickered. Elena adjusted the temperature, but the chill didn't dissipate. It was in the air. It was inside her head. They both turned when the voice came again, more clearly this time, cutting through the static like a blade. You have to come. The words were slow, deliberate, almost accusatory. We've waited so long. It's waiting. It's waiting for you. Elena's breath caught in her throat. Ivanov looked at her, his face pale, the lines around his eyes tightening. That wasn't... Ivanov began, his voice faltering. Did it say waiting for you? Yes, Elena whispered. It said it's waiting. For us. A moment of silence followed, but the dread in the room was palpable. Neither of them spoke for what felt like an eternity, as if words would somehow make the horror more real. Elena's mind raced. She felt the deep, gnawing sense of responsibility that had always driven her throughout her career. She was the one who had trained to be a leader in these moments. She was the one who had prepared for the unknown. Yet, here she was, standing at the edge of something she could neither define nor fully comprehend. What if it wasn't a human voice? What if it was something else? Before she could speak again, the screen flickered, distorting the transmission. A garbled mix of whispers surged through the speakers, unintelligible and wild. She looked at the data output. A new transmission was incoming. Elena, help. You must help. Before it's too late. Before it finds you. The words were broken, fragmentary, but clear enough to understand the urgency. The voice was no longer simply asking for help. It was warning them. Are we really going to follow this? Ivanov asked, his voice a mixture of disbelief and terror. He clenched his jaw, eyes darting between the screen and Elena. She didn't reply at first. She couldn't. For the first time in years, she didn't have an answer. All her training, all her instinct, was telling her that this was a mistake. But the call, the desperation in that voice was almost unbearable. She couldn't leave it unanswered. You heard it, Elena said slowly. It's real. We can't just turn away. If there's someone out there, if someone needs us. Ivanov's gaze softened, but the fear in his eyes hadn't left. And if it's not a person? He asked, his voice tinged with a quiet, grim certainty. What if it's something else? The question hung in the air like a weight. Elena could feel her heart pounding in her chest, the cold sweat on her brow. She knew the risks. She had read about the disappearances, the lost crews and their last, strange messages, the inexplicable signals that led nowhere. The vastness of space was a breeding ground for the unknown, for something beyond human understanding. But there was something else she had to consider. There was a feeling growing inside her, deep within the recesses of her mind, a whisper, barely audible, but growing louder with each passing moment. She recognized it. It had always been there, the nagging feeling that something was waiting, something ancient and vast. No one ever comes back from those regions, Ivanov murmured, his voice now thick with fear. Not from that part of space. Elena shook her head. We can't ignore it. We have to investigate. We have to know what's out there. A silence settled between them, one filled with the weight of their decision. The fate of the crew, of the Astra 7, and their place in the unknown galaxy hung in the balance. With trembling hands, Elena began to key in the coordinates for the next course of action. It wasn't just a scientific curiosity that drove her. It was the need to know. The need to understand the source of that voice. It was a call, a summons, and there was only one thing left to do. Set course for the Kestrel Nebula, Elena ordered. Her voice was firm, but there was an edge to it, an undertone of dread that she could not shake. She had just made the decision. She had just opened the door to whatever lay beyond. Ivanov didn't protest. He merely nodded. There was no turning back. The hum of the engines changed. The starboard console flickered to life. The Astra 7 had begun its journey, its engines roaring in quiet defiance of the vast cold void that awaited them. But in the silence that followed, Elena felt something stirring in the distance. A presence in the dark. It was waiting. And it had been waiting for a long time. Chapter 2. The Signal Echoes. The vastness of space stretched before them, an endless abyss that swallowed light and time itself. The stars, once familiar and comforting, now felt distant and indifferent, like a cold audience watching their every move. Astra 7 cut through the void, its engines humming steadily as it made its way toward the Kestrel Nebula. But the deeper they traveled, the more Elena could feel the weight of the silence. It wasn't just the absence of sound. It was the absence of everything. The stars were farther now, like pinpricks in a vast, unfathomable blackness. Elena stood by the viewport, gazing out at the void, her breath fogging up the glass as she pressed her forehead against it. The nebula's outer rim was just beginning to appear in the distance, a faint swirl of color against the inky black backdrop of space. It looked harmless from here, beautiful even. But she knew better, the signal they had intercepted earlier. That voice, now echoed in her mind with a relentless, maddening clarity. "It's waiting for you." She could still hear it, feel it pulsing in the back of her skull, like a dull ache. It wasn't just a voice. It was a presence. The more she thought about it, the more the words seemed to resonate with something deep inside her, something primal and unspoken. There was no doubt in her mind that something was out there, waiting. But what? Who? And why? "Elena, you need to rest," Ivanov's voice broke through her thoughts. He had been standing quietly in the doorway, watching her with an unreadable expression. There was a faint weariness in his eyes, a shadow of doubt that had only grown since their departure. "We're still hours away from reaching the nebula. You can't be running on fumes." Elena turned to face him, her eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep, but her expression hard. "I can't stop now, Ivanov. Not until we know the truth." He sighed and stepped into the room, his boots making soft thuds against the metal floor. He looked around, as if searching for something, some kind of reassurance, but the sterile, cold surroundings offered no comfort. The ship's artificial lights flickered intermittently, casting long shadows on the walls. It was as though the ship itself was reluctant to make this journey, as if it knew the fate of its passengers would be sealed the moment they entered the nebula. Truth? Or just answers you want to hear? Ivanov's voice was soft, but there was an edge to it. "Sometimes the truth isn't something we're meant to know, Elena. Sometimes it's better left buried." She shot him a sharp look, but he didn't back away. "You know as well as I do that we can't turn back. Not now." "I know," Ivanov muttered, "but I don't like the feeling in the pit of my stomach. This isn't just some stray signal. It feels like something is pushing us." Elena felt a chill run down her spine at his words. It wasn't just the deep space around them, or the terrifying unknown that haunted her. It was the realization that Ivanov had just put into words what she'd been unwilling to admit to herself. They weren't heading into the nebula. They were being drawn into it. "Do you hear it too?" Elena asked, her voice almost a whisper. "The signal. It keeps calling, over and over." Ivanov met her gaze, his face pale. "I hear it. I think. It's in my dreams now. Not just the voice, but the feeling. Like something is reaching for me, but I can't make sense of it. I don't know what's real anymore." She shuddered, her skin prickling with the fear that had slowly begun to take hold of her mind. "We have to go on," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "We have no choice." They stood in silence for a moment, both of them caught in the invisible tension that had settled over the crew. The rest of the team had retreated to their quarters or to their stations, unwilling to acknowledge the unease that gripped the ship. The few words spoken were always practical, technical, anything to avoid the truth that hovered over them all. "All right," Ivanov said, breaking the silence. But if we're going to do this, we need to stay vigilant. We don't know what we're dealing with. If something's waiting for us out there, we need to be prepared. Elena nodded, but deep down, she knew there was no way to prepare for what lay ahead. They were too far gone. The unknown had already swallowed them whole. Hours later, and the Astra 7 was now approaching the outer rim of the Kestrel Nebula. The stars seemed to blink out one by one as the ship moved closer to the swirling colors of gas and dust. The atmosphere on board had shifted again. Darker, heavier, conversations had stopped. The usual hum of activity was muted. Every glance between crew members seemed laden with unsaid words. The tension was palpable, almost suffocating. Elena stood at the central command station, watching the sensors display the swirling mass of the nebula. There was no denying its beauty, but it was a beauty that held danger, an allure perhaps that masked its true nature. The cosmic dust cloud stretched for light years, but within its depths there were regions unexplored, untouched by human hands. This was territory far beyond any known exploration routes. Entering the nebula now, the navigator's voice broke through the silence. Prepare for turbulence. Expect interference. Elena gripped the edge of the console, her knuckles white. The ship began to shake, the engines roaring in protest as they pushed deeper into the nebula. The swirling colors outside the viewport seemed to shift and change, as though the nebula itself was alive, pulsing with some strange, inhuman rhythm. And then it happened. The signal returned. It wasn't just a message anymore. It was a presence. The voice came through the speakers once again, but this time, there was something different about it. Something more sinister. It wasn't the pleading, desperate voice they had heard before. This one was calmer, almost seductive. Welcome. The voice flowed through the ship like a soft whisper, smooth and inviting, but underneath was an unmistakable undertone of menace. I've been waiting for you. You're finally here. Elena froze, her heart thudding in her chest. The words wrapped around her, pulling her deeper into the abyss. It was impossible to ignore, impossible to escape. She glanced around at the crew, who were all staring at the speakers, their faces pale with fear. Who are you? Elena whispered into the void, not expecting an answer, but the voice responded, low and velvety, seeping into her mind like a poison. I am what you seek. I am the end of your journey, the answer to all your questions. Elena felt her pulse quicken. No, she whispered, shaking her head. This is not what we signed up for. You're already here, the voice purred. You've come so far. You can't go back now. The air in the room seemed to thicken, pressing down on them. The walls felt closer. Elena could hear the breath of every crew member, the collective dread hanging in the air like a storm about to break. Turn it off, Ivanov demanded, his voice shaking as he moved to the console. We need to get out of here. But the voice was louder now, drowning out everything else. You can't escape me. You are mine now, and you will stay until the end. Chapter 2. The Signal Echoes, Part 2. The words still hung in the air, reverberating like a ghostly echo, long after the voice faded from the speakers. You can't escape me. You are mine now, and you will stay until the end. The last syllable seemed to linger in the ship's sterile corridors, pressing in from all sides, thick and suffocating. The Astra 7 groaned as it pushed forward through the nebula, the engines straining against the gravitational forces surrounding them. Elena stood motionless, her body numb. The blood in her veins felt as though it had turned to ice, leaving her cold to the bone. The silence that followed the voice felt unnatural, almost as if the universe itself had drawn a breath and held it, waiting. Turn it off, Ivanov demanded, his hands shaking as he moved to the control panel. His voice had a raw edge to it, as though he, too, could feel the pressure in the air, the weight of the presence pressing in on them. Something's wrong, Elena murmured, though she wasn't sure who she was speaking to. This isn't just a signal. Ivanov paused, his fingers hovering over the console. He shot a quick glance toward her, then back to the screen. His eyes narrowed as he navigated through the system, but nothing responded. The signal had completely overridden the comms. Nothing they did would stop it. "I can't," Ivanov whispered, his face pale. "The controls aren't responding. It's as if something's taken over." A sudden hiss sounded from the ventilation system, followed by a faint crackle of static. The ship's lights flickered, casting long, jagged shadows across the walls. The hum of the engine seemed to stutter, as though the entire vessel was caught between two worlds. Elena felt it then, a sensation she couldn't put into words, like they were no longer fully in the Astra 7, but somewhere else. A place just beyond their reach, just beyond what the ship's sensors could detect. Her heart raced. She pressed a hand to her chest as though she could physically calm the fear that was choking her. But then, something caught her eye. It was a shadow. It moved across the corner of her vision, too fast to be something natural, like a fleeting shape that didn't belong. A trick of the light. She didn't think so. She turned sharply toward the corridor, eyes narrowing. But there was nothing there. Just empty, cold hallways stretching away into the darkness of the ship. Nothing out of place. Still, her instincts told her otherwise. The shadow had been real, even if it wasn't. The presence was growing stronger, settling into the ship like an unseen weight pressing down on them. "Captain!" Lieutenant Tarasov's voice broke through the tension, and Elena turned to face him. His face was drawn, his normally composed demeanor cracked. "The systems, they're all failing. We're losing control. The ship's not responding to commands. We're drifting toward the core of the nebula." Elena's breath hitched. "What do you mean we're losing control?" "It's like something is guiding us," he said, his voice trembling with an emotion Elena hadn't expected. Fear. "We're not just being pulled in by the nebula's gravity. It's as if the ship is being directed by something." A shiver ran down her spine. The voice. It wasn't just a message, a signal, a warning. It was alive, and it had a purpose. Before she could respond, the voice returned, smoother now, more insistent. "You've come so far, my children," it purred, reverberating through the ship's speakers, vibrating deep in her bones. "I can feel you, feel your fear. It makes you so much more real." The last word, real, echoed inside Elena's mind, and for a brief, fleeting moment, she felt herself growing lighter, as if something had begun to lift her from the weight of her own thoughts. But it was not a comforting sensation. It was the opposite. She felt detached, as if her very essence was being pulled away, stripped of everything that made her human. Ivanov stumbled back from the console, a deep groan escaping his throat. "This is it. We're not alone in this space. Whatever this is, it's with us." Elena's eyes darted to him. His face was twisted in confusion, sweat beading along his forehead as his hands gripped the control panel, but he couldn't seem to look away from the screen. The starfield had vanished. What replaced it was the darkness of the nebula, a swirling mass of color and light, but no longer beautiful. It was something alive now, pulsing, breathing. She rushed over to him, grabbing his arm. "We need to fight it," she whispered urgently. "We need to get to the core and shut everything down. This is beyond just a signal. It's controlling us." Ivanov barely nodded, his gaze distant. She could see it now. His eyes were glazed, unfocused, as though whatever was with them had already begun to take hold of his mind, twisting it, making him doubt what he knew. But it was too late to turn back. Hours later. The Astra 7 crept deeper into the nebula, the vastness of the swirling clouds surrounding them. They had passed the point of no return, and Elena knew it. The ship's systems were failing, flickering in and out of response. The lights dimmed and brightened erratically, casting grotesque shadows across the walls, and the comms were nothing but static. The voice, the presence, had stopped speaking, but Elena could still hear it. It wasn't a sound anymore. It was a feeling, a weight pressing down on her from all sides. "Captain," Lieutenant Tarasov spoke again, his voice tight with fear. "The ship, it's showing signs of damage. There are breaches in the hull. Structural integrity is compromised." We need to abort the mission. Elena shook her head slowly, her mind swimming with confusion and dread. The ship's path was erratic now, the entire craft pitching and yawing like it was being torn apart. Her hands clenched into fists. We can't turn back. Not until we know what's happening. Elena, please. Ivanov's voice came from behind her, low and strained. She didn't turn to look at him, but she could feel the tension in his words, the desperation. It's calling to us, he said, his voice barely audible. We've heard it. We're all hearing it. The voice returned, but it wasn't a whisper anymore. It was clearer, louder, commanding. I've been waiting for you. Elena swallowed hard. The words hit her like a physical blow, taking her breath away. Her vision swam, and she stumbled slightly, as if the very air had become too thick to breathe. You will never leave. And that was when she understood. It wasn't just a signal. It was a trap. Her thoughts turned to the truth that was now glaringly obvious. The Astra 7 had been brought here for a reason, to this forsaken place in the depths of space, to this endless abyss where the voice now reigned. They weren't going to find answers. They were going to become part of the darkness. They were going to be forgotten, just like the others before them. You belong to me now. Eleanor's heart pounded. The ship groaned, its systems failing more rapidly with each passing second. The lights flickered once more, this time casting their glow on something she couldn't explain. A shape, not quite human, standing at the far end of the hallway. And then, nothing. The ship fell silent again. Chapter 3. The Empty Horizon. The Astra 7 drifted deeper into the heart of the nebula, and Elena could feel it now. The space around them was not just an empty void. It was as if the nebula itself was alive, a vast, pulsating organism wrapped around the ship, pressing against them from all sides. She could almost hear its heartbeat, a rhythmic thrum in the air, faint but constant. The pulse seemed to seep into their bones, making the hairs on the back of her neck rise. Elena stood in the observation deck, staring out into the inky blackness beyond the glass. The stars, once so sharp, so bright, were now dull smudges, swallowed by the growing darkness that encased them. There was no longer any recognizable structure in the vastness, no guiding points of reference. The edges of space and time seemed to warp, shifting unpredictably, and with each passing moment, Elena felt a creeping sense of detachment, as if they were no longer part of the universe they knew. The ship groaned again, the low hum of its engines now a distant murmur, barely enough to reassure them that the Astra 7 was still functioning. It was the only thing that held them together now, the only tangible connection to the world outside. "Captain!" Ivanov's voice broke through the silence, pulling Elena from her thoughts. She turned to face him, her hand instinctively brushing the cold glass of the observation window. Ivanov was pale, his face drawn tight with anxiety, but there was something else in his eyes, a glimmer of fear, of dread that spoke more than words ever could. "We have a problem." Elena raised an eyebrow. What kind of problem? He hesitated for a moment, his gaze flicking to the dark corridor behind them as though he half expected someone, or something, to be watching. "The systems are still offline. Nothing's working as it should. But it's not just that. I think something's in the ship with us." A chill ran down Elena's spine, and she felt the weight of his words settle heavily over her. They had all felt it, the strange, oppressive presence that seemed to settle deeper into the ship's walls. But to hear Ivanov speak it aloud made it all the more real. "Like a ghost?" Elena asked, though she couldn't hide the edge of skepticism in her voice. Ivanov shook his head. "No, not a ghost. Not exactly. It's more like it's alive. Something alive is on this ship with us. It's inside." Elena frowned. "Inside?" She took a step closer to him, her mind racing. "What do you mean by that? You think something stowed away on the ship?" "I'm not sure," Ivanov admitted, "but I keep hearing things. Whispers, soft voices, always just beyond hearing. And sometimes I feel like I'm being watched, like something is moving just behind me. But when I turn, there's nothing there. He paused, looking at her with a kind of desperation in his eyes. I don't know how much longer I can stay calm, Captain. I swear, this place, it's getting into my head. Elena exhaled slowly, forcing herself to remain composed. Panic was the last thing they needed right now. The crew was already on edge, and if Ivanov, who had always been the strong, steady presence in their missions, was starting to crack, then the situation was worse than she'd feared. I understand, she said softly. We all feel it, but we can't let it control us. We need to focus, find a way to break free of this influence. She gave him a firm look. Get the crew together. We'll meet in the control room. Ivanov nodded, though his expression was still clouded with doubt. He turned to leave, but as he did, something caught his eye. A shadow, flickering, quick, darted across the hall just behind him. His eyes narrowed, and for a split second, Elena saw a flash of fear in his features before he masked it again. Did you see that? He asked, his voice low. Elena glanced at the hallway but saw nothing. The dim lighting of the ship cast long shadows, distorting the walls in strange shapes, but there was no movement. See what? She asked, though her own pulse quickened. Ivanov's eyes remained fixed on the darkness beyond the doorway. Nothing, he said after a long moment. I'm probably just imagining things. Elena didn't believe him. She had seen it too. A fleeting glimpse, a shape that didn't quite belong, as if something, or someone, was waiting just out of sight, but she said nothing. She couldn't afford to show weakness now. I'll meet you in the control room, she said curtly, turning away from him. The control room was dim, the only light coming from the flickering screens, their data barely registering as the systems continued to fail. The crew had gathered, but the tension in the air was palpable. No one spoke, their eyes darting nervously from one to another, the uncertainty thickening with every passing second. Elena took a seat at the center, her fingers drumming lightly on the armrest of her chair as she watched them. Each person on this mission had been chosen for their resilience, their ability to withstand the unimaginable. But now, in the face of whatever was happening, it was clear that even their training had its limits. We can't keep running on autopilot, Lieutenant Tarasov said, breaking the silence. His voice was strained, tight with the pressure they were all under. We need to make decisions. We need to find out where we are and what this thing is doing to us. Elena nodded slowly. Agreed, but we don't know what we're dealing with here. We don't even know if there's anything left outside the nebula. For all we know, the rest of the universe has moved on without us. The signal, Lieutenant Ivanov interrupted, his voice low and trembling. We can still pick it up, right? The signal from that station. Elena hesitated. They had been trying to track the signal ever since the ship had entered the nebula, but it had been a dead end. The static was too dense, the interference too great. I'm not sure it's coming from anywhere specific anymore, she said. It's not just a signal. It's something more. Ivanov's eyes widened. You mean it's alive? It's not just a transmission? Elena met his gaze, her stomach tightening. I don't know, but whatever it is, it's manipulating us. It's controlling the ship. It's not just a signal, it's a presence. The lights flickered again, and the temperature seemed to drop slightly. A cold shiver ran down Elena's spine as she stared at the screen in front of her. A new readout appeared, one she didn't recognize. It was faint, but there, nonetheless, a series of numbers, coordinates, and, just underneath them, something else. Look, it sees you. The words were written in strange, jagged characters, as though they had been typed in haste, but they were clear, and they were meant for her. Her heart skipped a beat, and her blood turned cold. Captain! Ivanov's voice trembled, a sudden unease creeping into his words. We're being watched. Elena's breath caught in her throat. The presence was here, and it was watching them. The walls of the ship seemed to close in, the air thickening with a pressure she couldn't explain. A low hum, different from the ship's engines, began to vibrate through the floors. A sound that wasn't mechanical but organic, as though the ship itself was alive. Get to your stations, Elena snapped, her voice hard. Prepare for anything. but the words didn't carry the same conviction they once had. She wasn't sure they were ready for whatever was coming. Hours later, the hum had become louder. The vibrations were felt in every corner of the ship, and the crew moved in uneasy silence, their faces drawn with exhaustion. They had been working without rest, trying to reroute the systems, to gain control over the failing ship, but nothing worked. The signal was everywhere, wrapping around them like a suffocating web. Eleanor stood by the window in the observation room again, her gaze fixed on the swirling chaos outside. The nebula had deepened into a swirling black maw that seemed to beckon them forward, pulling them deeper into its grasp. But there was something else now, a presence moving just beneath the surface of the stars. Something alive, something waiting. The shadows outside the window began to shift, elongating, as though they had a life of their own. Elena felt her breath catch in her throat. Her heart hammered in her chest as she backed away from the window, her eyes wide with horror. From the corner of the room, she heard a soft whisper, "You can't escape." And she knew, with a certainty that gripped her very soul, that they never would. Chapter 4. Beneath the Weight of Silence. And the silence had become oppressive, as though the Astra 7 itself was suffocating under the heavy weight of an unseen presence. Elena could hear her breath, steady, deliberate, fill the quiet of the control room. The crew had long since abandoned their posts, retreating to various corners of the ship, where the air was colder, the shadows darker. But no matter where they went, the feeling followed. It slithered in the corners of the ship, under the floorboards, above the ceilings. It was in the very walls, and the metal panels seemed to groan and shift with every passing second, as if trying to contain the thing that lived within. Eleanor stood at the observation deck again, her eyes fixed on the nebulous void outside. The stars had completely disappeared now, swallowed by the growing darkness that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. She no longer believed they were even in the same dimension anymore. Time had become meaningless. Each moment dragged into the next, and the line between reality and madness blurred with every passing second. But what had begun as an eerie feeling now had a name. The presence, the thing they had all felt but couldn't see, was a predator, stalking them through the shadows. It was inside their minds, inside the ship. Elena had always believed in the strength of science, in the rational, the explainable. But now she knew better. There was nothing rational here, nothing explainable. The crew had attempted everything they knew. They had tried to cut the power. They had tried to recalibrate the communications, to signal for help. But all their efforts had failed. The systems were beyond repair, each new command falling into an abyss of static and disrepair. All their training, all their experience. It was as though it meant nothing in the face of whatever was out there. It had begun with whispers, soft at first, like the rustling of wind or the faintest echo of voices carried on the air. But now, the whispers had grown into murmurs, hissing voices that seemed to follow them from room to room. The ship was filled with them, a chorus of disembodied voices that taunted, that beckoned. And sometimes, just sometimes, Eleanor could hear her name, soft, barely audible, on the edge of her hearing, as if the thing was calling to her. But the worst part, it wasn't the voices, it wasn't the cold, it wasn't the static-filled screens or the malfunctioning systems. It was the feeling that they were no longer alone on the ship, no longer the masters of their vessel. It was the creeping knowledge that something was walking among them, watching them. The hallway. Sergei was the first to crack. It had started with the shadows. They had all seen them, moving unnaturally, stretching in ways that were impossible for the light to create. He had dismissed it at first, told himself it was the stress, the lack of sleep, the pressure of the unknown. But then, one night, as he walked down the hallway, the shadows had moved toward him. Slithering across the floor, curling up the walls, they had reached for him. Sergei had stumbled backward, his heart hammering in his chest, but there was no escape. The walls felt too close. The ship felt smaller, tighter, as though the very air itself was closing in. He had called out, but there was no response. Only the relentless echo of his own voice, distorted and stretched. And then the voice had come. "Sergei." It was a whisper, but there was nothing soft about it. The voice was guttural, like it came from somewhere deep, deep within the bowels of the earth. It had felt like the walls of the ship were closing in on him. The breath in his chest had stopped, his lungs crushed by a weight far beyond the physical. He had sprinted down the hallway, not daring to look behind, and not once had he dared to stop. He didn't even remember how he had ended up back in his quarters. When he finally slammed the door shut, his body trembled from the cold. The next morning, he hadn't said a word. No one had asked. They knew. The thing inside them knew. At the cargo bay. Yulia had always been the bravest of the crew. She was the one who had volunteered for the most dangerous assignments, the one who'd never flinched when the mission required a degree of courage that few others possessed. But now, as she entered the cargo bay, she found herself hesitating. The door slid open with a mechanical hiss, and the room was plunged into darkness. The lights flickered overhead, casting long, jagged shadows that twisted unnaturally, stretching across the floor like some grotesque parody of life. It had been her idea to investigate the ship's storage area, hoping to find a logical explanation for the strange disturbances. After all, there had to be a mechanical reason for the growing unease they all felt, didn't there? Some faulty wiring, some glitch in the system. Maybe the ghosts of their malfunctioning instruments were making them paranoid. But now, standing alone in the center of the cold bay, the weight of the darkness pressing on her chest, she wasn't so sure. She stepped forward, her boots echoing loudly in the empty room. The air was stale, cold enough to bite at her skin. She tried to ignore the sound of her heartbeat pounding in her ears, the oppressive silence that surrounded her. Something was wrong. She could feel it, under her skin, crawling in her blood. Then the light flickered once more, and this time, it didn't stop. It buzzed overhead, steady and bright, but it cast strange, distorted shadows against the walls. Yulia stared at them for a moment, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. The shadows were moving. She wasn't imagining it. The shapes, they were alive. They stretched, they warped, they twisted like ropes, crawling across the walls toward her. And in the center of it all, just beyond the shadows, she saw a figure, a man, or something like it. He was tall, his frame elongated, twisted as though it had been distorted by some impossible force. His face was pale, a blank canvas of features. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just a flat, featureless surface, as though someone had removed every piece of humanity from him. He was just a shell. The figure didn't move. It didn't need to. It was watching her. Yulia backed away, her breath caught in her throat, but the shadows reached for her, pulling her closer. She cried out, but it was a sound swallowed by the growing hum around her. And then the lights went out. At the control room. Back in the control room, Eleanor could feel the tension mounting. She could hear it in their voices, the rising panic, the uncertainty. They were all fighting it, desperately clinging to the remnants of their rational minds, but she could see it in their eyes. The fear was there. They were all starting to lose it. "Where is Sergei?" Ivanov demanded, his voice sharp, but underneath the anger, there was fear. The crew was fracturing, and he could see it. There was no denying it. "I don't know," Elena said quietly, though her voice held no conviction. Sergei hadn't returned to his quarters since the night before, and no one had heard from him. They were beginning to suspect he wasn't coming back. "I don't think we can wait any longer," Ivanov continued, stepping toward the control panel. "We need to leave this place." Eleanor glanced at the readout on the wall, the one that showed the ship's trajectory, but there was nothing. It was as if the nebula had erased all traces of their navigation. They were adrift, hopelessly lost in the vast oppressive void. And in the silence, the whispers started again. Louder this time. "Elena!" She froze, her body rigid with fear. It was her voice, her own name, but not her own voice. No, not her. She turned to the others, but they were no longer themselves either. Their faces were blank, their eyes dark, and the air around them seemed to grow colder. The Astra 7 had become a tomb, and something was watching them. Chapter 5. Echoes in the Dark. Elena stood at the center of the control room, her fingers pressed tightly against the cold surface of the console. The lights flickered sporadically, casting erratic shadows that twisted like phantoms. Her breathing was shallow, her chest tight, as though the very air in the room had thickened. She wasn't sure if the heaviness she felt was the weight of the Astra 7 itself, or something more sinister. Something alive. The others were scattered around the room, their faces pale, eyes sunken with exhaustion and fear. Sergei was still missing, though no one dared to mention it out loud. His disappearance had been too abrupt, too strange to ignore. It was as if he had simply vanished into the ship's walls, swallowed by the black void they were trapped within. Yulia had been the last to see him, her frantic calls for help still echoing in Elena's mind. But it wasn't just Sergei's disappearance that troubled her. It was the sense that something had changed, something had awakened aboard the ship. The echoes of their voices now seemed to be followed by a faint, static-like noise, as if something was listening in, watching them. The whispers were growing louder. Each crew member heard them, though they had yet to acknowledge it openly. A few of them had begun to act differently, nervously glancing over their shoulders, shifting uncomfortably in their chairs as though they were being followed. "Elena!" She spun around, heart racing. No one was behind her. The voice was unmistakable. Her name, drawn out in a way that was both her own and not her own. It was the voice of something otherworldly, something that existed beyond the confines of reality. Her gaze shot to the other crew members, but they hadn't heard it. They were busy fiddling with the malfunctioning instruments, desperately trying to restore some order to the chaos that had engulfed them. But Elena could feel the tension thick in the air. They were all on edge, their nerves fraying with each passing moment. The ship had become something else, a living, breathing entity, and they were merely insects caught in its web, or Arista Schwammswem on the observation deck. Ivanov had taken to wandering the corridors again, something he hadn't done since their first few days in deep space. There was something about the corridors, their dim, flickering lights, the faint hum of machinery, that made him feel uneasy, as though they were moving, changing, like the ship itself was alive, shifting and twisting as it reached for them. It was on the observation deck that Ivanov first truly noticed it. He had been standing at the window, watching the dark expanse of space, his mind numb from the isolation and fear, when a cold breeze swept over him. The air was thin and dry, and for a moment, he thought it might be the malfunctioning ventilation system. But as he turned, he felt a sudden, sharp pressure on his chest, something heavy and oppressive. He gasped for breath, his hands clutching at his throat. The light outside the window seemed to warp, stretching and distorting, and for the briefest moment, he could have sworn he saw something moving out there, something huge, something alive. He blinked, and when his eyes refocused, the space outside the window was empty. The cold wind had stopped. But Ivanov knew. He knew that something was out there. He could feel it, watching. He turned to leave, but as he did, he heard it again. The whisper. Soft, insistent, but this time, not in his ears. It was in his mind. It was speaking directly to him. "Come closer." He staggered backward, his heart pounding as the voice echoed in his head. There was no one else on the deck, only him, alone. His pulse raced as he bolted from the room, running through the darkened corridors as fast as his legs would carry him. The whispers were following him, growing louder with each passing step. They wrapped around his thoughts, threading through his mind like a serpent winding tighter with every beat of his heart. And then he heard it. Footsteps, soft, shuffling footsteps, closing in behind him. He turned, but no one was there. The main hall. Yulia sat at the table in the mess hall, her hands trembling as she stared at the unappetizing food in front of her. The dim lights overhead buzzed, casting a faint yellow glow over the empty chairs. The silence felt suffocating, as though the walls were closing in around her. Her mind kept replaying the images she had seen. The man with no face, the shadows that reached for her, the cold, unnatural presence in the cargo bay. The hallucinations had started soon after she'd entered the cargo bay, but now they were worse. They were everywhere, creeping into every corner of her mind. She could feel them, cold fingers brushing against her skin, distant voices calling her name, muffled and indistinct, as though someone was just beyond the walls. She couldn't take it anymore. But when she reached for the communicator to contact the others, she froze. The screen flickered to life, a crackling static filling the room, and then, just as quickly, the image shifted. It was Sergei. His face was twisted in agony, his eyes wide, empty, his mouth opened, but no sound came out. The static grew louder until it drowned out all sense of reality. The screen flickered again, and for a brief moment the image of Sergei vanished, replaced by something different. It was a face, but it was not human. The features were elongated, unnatural. Its eyes were too large, too black. It grinned, a twisted, jagged smile that stretched impossibly wide. Yulia! The voice came from everywhere. It was inside her mind, inside the very air she breathed. It was the thing behind the wall, the thing behind the whisper. Yulia screamed, her hands shaking as she pulled away from the screen. But the voice didn't stop. Yulia, don't leave. You belong here. The crew's descent. Days passed, or what passed for days. Time had become a fluid concept aboard the Astra 7. The ship seemed to exist in a constant state of disrepair, the halls echoing with the faint hum of machines struggling to function. The crew had begun to fracture. They no longer worked together, no longer spoke to each other unless absolutely necessary. There were no more attempts at repairs, no more attempts at contacting anyone beyond the ship. The communication system had completely failed, and there was nothing left but the deep, unyielding silence. Elena had stopped sleeping. She no longer had the luxury of rest. The ship was alive, she was sure of it. It was watching them, waiting for something, but she couldn't understand what. The whispers, the sounds, the unnatural events, they were all connected, but how? Each passing hour felt like an eternity. They were trapped not only in the ship but within their own minds. The ship had become their prison. There was no escape, and it was only a matter of time before the ship claimed them all. Chapter 5. Echoes in the Dark. Part 2. The eerie silence of the Astra 7 was suffocating. Eleanor's fingers trembled against the console, her pulse pounding in her throat as the echoes of the voice faded. She had no idea how much time had passed since she had heard that whisper, or even since the others had gone missing. They had all become little more than fragments of their former selves, lost to the haunting emptiness that had engulfed the ship. She stood in the dimly lit control room, staring blankly at the array of malfunctioning instruments. The lights flickered overhead, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. The ship's systems groaned and rattled as if protesting the very idea of functioning. The Astra 7 was a broken shell of its former self, much like the crew. The whispers had become constant now. Soft, distant voices that no one could place. At first, they had sounded like static, faint whispers that drifted in and out of the communication system. But now they were louder, more distinct. They were almost familiar. The voices of the crew who had disappeared, echoing through the ship like ghosts searching for a way home. But Elena knew the truth. They weren't coming back. No one would. Her heart skipped a beat as she caught movement in the corner of her eye. She spun around, her breath catching in her throat. But there was nothing. Nothing but the oppressive darkness and the faint hum of the malfunctioning equipment. Was she losing her mind? She shook her head, trying to clear the dizzying fog that clouded her thoughts. No, she wasn't losing her mind. The ship was. The ship was alive, and it was suffocating them all. She reached for the communicator, her fingers brushing the cold metal of the device. She thought about calling out to Yulia or Ivanov, someone, anyone, but she hesitated. What if they weren't there anymore? What if they had already succumbed to whatever madness was creeping through the air? The air on the ship was thick, heavy with something that felt like a presence, watching them, waiting. Eleanor had long since stopped believing it was merely her imagination. She had seen it too many times now. The way the shadows twisted in the corners of rooms, the flicker of lights in the dead of night, and the cold. The unnatural cold that seeped through the walls, creeping into her bones, No matter how many layers of clothing she wore, she couldn't escape it. She couldn't outrun it. The ship was pulling her in. The hallways of despair. Ivanov had been wandering the dark, winding corridors of the Astra 7 for what felt like hours. It had become his ritual to walk these same corridors, driven by an insatiable need to keep moving. His mind was unraveling, his thoughts splintering in every direction, but he could not stop. Not even when the walls began to pulse with an unnatural rhythm. As though the ship itself had a heartbeat, the lights flickered again, casting long, jagged shadows down the narrow hallway. Ivanov stopped, his hand gripping the wall for support, his breath shallow. His chest felt tight, constricted, as if the ship were physically squeezing the air from his lungs. The walls creaked, and he swore he could hear something scratching just beyond his reach, a faint, skittering sound that made his skin crawl. He tried to ignore it. He tried to keep walking, but the shadows were too much. They seemed to stretch and shift as though alive, like sentient beings that were watching him, tracking his every movement. There was something about the darkness. It felt wrong. Unnatural. No, it's not real. You're imagining things. Ivanov clenched his jaw and forced himself to move forward, but the whispers returned. This time, louder, more insistent. Ivanov. He stopped dead in his tracks. His eyes darted around, but there was no one. The ship was empty. Only him. The oppressive quiet hung heavily around him, broken only by the distant hum of the machinery. He turned back to the hallway. The shadows had grown longer, thicker, as though they were reaching for him. It felt as though the walls were breathing, expanding and contracting, pushing the air out of his lungs. His pulse quickened as he tried to take another step, but his feet felt like lead. He couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. Ivanov, help us. The voice was unmistakable now. It was Yulia's voice, but it was distorted, stretched out of shape by the ship's own malevolent energy. It was like the voice of someone calling from the depths of a nightmare, familiar, yet twisted beyond recognition. He closed his eyes, pressing his hands against his ears to block out the sound. But the voice grew louder. The walls seemed to pulse with it, the air thickening as if it were solidifying around him. He could feel it closing in. Something was coming for him. He opened his eyes, and to his horror, he saw it. A figure standing at the far end of the hallway. A tall, thin shape, its features indistinct and blurry, as if it were made of smoke, shifting and flickering in the dark. He tried to run, but his legs wouldn't move. His body froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The figure began to move toward him, slowly, purposefully. The closer it came, the more real it became. Its form solidified, the shadowed face coming into view. It's not real, Ivanov told himself again. It's just your mind playing tricks. But it wasn't a trick. The figure reached out a long, skeletal hand, its fingers stretching toward him. The coldness of its touch seeped through the air, biting into his skin like ice. Ivanov! The voice was no longer distorted. It was clear now, and it came from the figure in front of him. It was Sergei. The crew's descent. Back in the control room, Elena's hand hovered over the console, her mind racing. She could hear the whispers growing louder, converging from all directions, pulling at the edges of her sanity. The air felt thick, like a heavy blanket suffocating her thoughts. The walls seemed to close in, their oppressive weight bearing down on her. Sergei, Yulia, Ivanov. The names echoed in her mind, indistinguishable from the whispers that filled the room. Were they still alive? Had they been swallowed by the ship, consumed by its dark hunger? Her chest tightened. She wanted to scream, to reach out to them, but the words caught in her throat. The ship had taken them. She had known it the moment she saw the way the shadows had twisted around them, the way they had begun to change. They were no longer the same people. Something had infected them, something dark and ancient. And Elena was no different. She could feel it now, deep inside her. The ship's presence, its hunger. It was inside her, clawing at her mind. It was pulling at her, unraveling her thoughts, stripping her away piece by piece. She gasped for breath, clutching at the console for support. But it was too late. The whispers were everywhere, drowning out her thoughts, filling her head with promises of oblivion. She had already become part of it. Chapter 6. The Haunting Beneath the Surface. The Astra 7 had become an unrecognizable nightmare. Its once pristine corridors now seemed warped, as if they had never been built to exist in this space. The walls groaned under the pressure of something unseen, something ancient and alive, and the air itself felt saturated with dread. Elena's breath was shallow as she staggered through the narrow hallway, the fluorescent lights flickering erratically above her. Her legs felt like lead, each step a painful effort as though she were trudging through thick, suffocating mud. Every corner she turned seemed to lead her into a new stretch of shadow, as if the ship were designed to trap her within its dark, labyrinthine bowels. She had not seen another soul in hours, perhaps days. Time had become irrelevant here. Her thoughts, too, had started to lose their shape, her mind slipping in and out of focus. She wasn't sure what was real anymore, and what was just a product of her unraveling sanity. Were the whispers she had heard earlier real, or had they simply been another hallucination brought on by exhaustion? Still, something about the ship's atmosphere felt different now. It wasn't just the malfunctions or the whispering voices. It was as though the ship itself was alive, and it knew she was there. A distant, blood-curdling scream shattered the silence. Her heart skipped a beat. It was Yulia's voice, unmistakable in its terror, reverberating through the air. Without thinking, Elena sprinted down the corridor, her pulse hammering in her ears. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her throat tightening with every step. She had to find them. She had to find her crew, her friends. But the further she ran, the more the ship seemed to distort, as if the walls themselves were shifting, closing in on her. "I'm losing my mind," she thought. But the scream echoed again, drawing her forward. She turned a corner and collided with something. Her hands shot out instinctively, grabbing the nearest surface. Something cold, smooth, metallic. She felt a shiver run down her spine as she realized the shape was a door, its edges jagged and rusted, its surface wet with some dark substance she couldn't quite identify. She could feel the heavy thrum of something deep within the walls, like a pulse, a heartbeat. Elena hesitated, her fingers brushing the door's surface. It was sticky with something warm and thick. No, it couldn't be. The door seemed to hum as she touched it, a deep, guttural sound vibrating through her bones. Then, in the silence that followed, Elena knew this was no ordinary room. The ship had been altered, manipulated by whatever malevolent force now had control over it. Taking a deep breath, Elena pushed the door open. The Atarakia in the Chamber of Broken Things. The room beyond the door was dim, lit only by the sickly glow of flickering emergency lights. It was unlike any part of the ship she had seen before. The walls were covered in strange symbols, scratched and scrawled into the metal, as though someone, or something, had been desperately clawing at them. Some of the symbols resembled ancient runes, others were more crude, like the random marks of a deranged mind. The air inside was thick, heavy with the stench of decay, and the faint sound of dripping water echoed in the distance. The floor was slick with something. Blood. Oil? Elena couldn't tell, but it was warm to the touch. At the far end of the room, something moved. She froze. Her breath caught in her throat as she saw a figure emerge from the shadows. It was Yulia, her hair matted with dirt, her clothes torn and filthy. She stumbled forward, her movements jerky and unnatural, her eyes wide with terror. But it wasn't Yulia anymore, not really. Her eyes were clouded, unblinking, and her skin had a sickly pallor, like that of a corpse left in the elements too long. Her hands, which had once been warm and familiar, now looked twisted, as though the bones inside had been crushed and reshaped by an unseen force. "Yulia," Elena whispered, her voice cracking. Yulia's lips twitched, but it wasn't her voice that spoke. It was something darker, something deeper. "Elena!" "It's too late." The words rasped from her throat like the grinding of bones. Elena's stomach lurched and she took a step back, nearly stumbling over the slick floor. "It's too late." The words repeated, growing louder, reverberating off the walls, until Eleanor could feel them pressing into her skull. The room seemed to close in around her. Her vision blurred, and she saw more figures emerge from the darkness. Figures that looked like her crew, but their faces were pale and hollow. Their movements were jerky, robotic, their eyes blank and empty. No, this isn't real. This can't be real. Eleanor's thoughts spiraled. She stumbled backward, but the figures kept advancing, their twisted bodies writhing toward her like insects drawn to light. "Please, no," Elena begged, her voice barely audible over the rising crescendo of whispers and screams. And then she saw it, a figure standing at the far end of the room. Taller than the rest, thin and gaunt, its face obscured by a cloak of shadows. A presence that seemed to devour the very air around it. It was the ship. No, it was the ship. The realization struck Elena like a physical blow. The Astra 7 itself was alive. It had been alive all along, waiting for something, or someone, waiting for me. The figure moved toward her with unnatural speed. Elena tried to run, but her legs betrayed her. She collapsed to the floor, her hands slick with the cold, dark fluid beneath her. The thing crouched down in front of her, its voice a low growl that seemed to echo directly in her mind. "You cannot escape me, Elena. We are bound now, all of us. You, me, and the ship. Forever." A wave of dizziness washed over her. She could feel herself slipping. The last remnants of her sanity clinging desperately to her. She tried to scream, but no sound emerged. Anzhatemaski, a descent into madness. Ivanov awoke with a start, his heart pounding in his chest. He was no longer in the hallway, no longer lost in the labyrinth of the ship. Instead, he was lying in what seemed like a makeshift medical bay. The faint smell of antiseptic in the air, but the feeling of dread still clung to him, like a heavy shroud. He shot up, his breath ragged. There was something wrong. He could feel it in his bones. The ship had changed. They had changed. His eyes darted around, trying to make sense of his surroundings, but everything felt wrong. The walls, the lights, they seemed to be closing in on him. He stood, his knees wobbling, and staggered toward the door. The ship creaked and groaned, and Ivanov could swear he felt the air shift, as if something was breathing. He reached the door and froze, his hand just inches away from the handle. A faint whisper reached his ears. "It's time, Ivanov. Time to join us." His heart raced as he spun around, but no one was there. The room seemed to pulse with energy, and he could feel the weight of it pressing down on him, as though the walls themselves were watching him. He had to get out. He had to find Eleanor, find Yulia, find anyone. But every step he took, every move he made, only seemed to lead him deeper into the heart of the nightmare. The ship was alive, and it wasn't going to let them go. Chapter 7. The Weight of the Void. The ship creaked like a dying animal, the metal groaning under the weight of some ancient, unseen force. It was a sound that had become all too familiar to Elena, a constant reminder of the malevolent presence that surrounded her. Every corner she turned, every shadow that crossed her path, seemed to mock her. There was no escape. There was no safety. She had thought she could run, thought she could escape into the depths of the ship. But now it felt like every inch of the Astra 7 was suffocating her. Each passageway twisted and bent, leading her deeper into the heart of the nightmare. The walls felt alive, pulsing with some unseen rhythm that seemed to call her closer to its core, to the thing that had taken over this ship. As she walked through the corridor, her senses dulled by exhaustion, she could hear faint whispers again, this time distant but undeniably there. They grew louder with each step, and despite herself, she found her legs moving toward the sound. It was like something inside her was urging her forward, something beyond her control. "Elena." She stopped dead in her tracks. The voice was unmistakable. It was Yulia's voice, but distorted, warped by some unnatural force. It echoed in her head, reverberating in a way that didn't feel like sound at all. It felt like it was coming from inside her skull. "Yulia," Elena whispered, her voice trembling. The silence that followed felt suffocating. pressing against her eardrums. She blinked, fighting the nausea that threatened to overtake her. Her hand reached out instinctively, gripping the wall beside her for support. "Eleanor, I'm sorry." The whisper came again, this time much clearer, and for a moment, Eleanor thought she saw the faint outline of a figure at the end of the corridor. The figure was a shape, shifting, writhing, its edges uncertain, as if it didn't belong to this world. Her heart hammered in her chest. No, it couldn't be Yulia, not like this. "Come to me," the voice urged, distorted and full of agony. The words, though incomprehensible, filled her mind with a sense of longing, a pull she couldn't ignore. Without thinking, Eleanor stepped forward, drawn by the force of the voice. Her eyes burned from the exertion of blinking too hard, her hands shaking, but she couldn't stop, she couldn't resist. Something in her was screaming, begging her to turn back, but it was too late. She was already moving forward, and then she heard it. A sound she couldn't place at first. The soft scrape of metal against metal, followed by the unmistakable clinking of chains dragging across the floor. It was a slow, deliberate sound, like someone, no, something, was dragging itself toward her. Her breath caught in her throat as she turned around. A figure stood in the darkened corridor behind her. It was tall, its features obscured by the low light, but there was no mistaking the presence of something deeply wrong. It stood motionless, its body unnaturally still, its limbs bent in grotesque angles that shouldn't have been possible. For a moment, Eleanor stood frozen, her entire body locked in terror. The figure didn't move. It just watched her, its form flickering like a shadow, unsure whether it belonged to this world or another. But she didn't have time to think. The voice came again, this time inside her head. "You should never have come." The voice was distant, but it felt like a slap across her face. It was suffocating, oppressive, drowning her in its sheer power. "We were never meant to be." It continued, each word growing darker, like the sound of a grave being dug. Elena's legs buckled beneath her, and she collapsed to the ground with a sickening thud, her palms sliding across the floor as her body trembled uncontrollably. She felt the cool metallic surface beneath her, but there was no relief in it, no safety, only the cold embrace of the ship, pulling her deeper into its heart. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw something that almost made her scream. It was Ivanov, but not the Ivanov she knew. This Ivanov was hunched over, his back arched at a painful angle. His face was gaunt, his eyes wide and unblinking, glowing faintly in the dark. His hands were stretched out, fingers twitching as though he were testing the air for something unseen. "Ivanov." Elena's voice was nothing more than a rasp, weak and choked with fear. He didn't respond. He didn't even blink. She tried to speak again, but her throat felt like it was filled with broken glass. She reached out toward him, her hand shaking as she struggled to rise to her feet. But when she touched his arm, it felt wrong. His skin was cold, slick like oil, and as her fingers brushed against his sleeve, she could feel something pulling at her, something reaching for her. "Help me," she whispered, the words barely forming in her mouth. But Ivanov's body jerked violently, his head snapping toward her with unnatural speed. His eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment, she saw it. The thing that had taken him, the hunger, the void that had consumed him, and now it was turning toward her. His lips twisted into a grotesque smile. "You can't escape it, Elena." Before she could react, a deafening scream echoed through the ship, a scream that seemed to come from everywhere at once, reverberating through the walls and shaking the very foundations of the Astra 7. It was the sound of something breaking, something primal and ancient, something too terrible to comprehend. Ivanov's form began to unravel. His body twitched, spasmed, and with a sickening lurch his flesh seemed to split open, revealing a black, gaping hole where his chest had once been. The hole pulsed, glowing with a dim, malevolent light. It was as if something inside him was trying to break free, something far worse than death. The whispers returned, louder now, filling her mind with their unbearable pressure. "It's here." The voice was everywhere, inside her, consuming her thoughts. Elena felt herself slipping, her vision blurring, her body growing heavier, as though the ship itself was weighing her down. The floor tilted beneath her, and she could feel the walls shifting again, bending, twisting like the labyrinthine mind of a mad god. The ship wasn't just alive, it was madness, it was the void. And they were all trapped inside it. Chapter 8. The Pulse of the Void. Elena awoke with a start, gasping for air, her chest heaving as though she had been submerged underwater for hours. The darkness around her was thick, suffocating, pressing against her like the weight of the cosmos itself. She could hear the ship's groaning metal, a low, mournful cry that echoed through the walls, reverberating in her bones. It wasn't just the sound of a ship struggling in space. It was something deeper, something alive, something hungry. Her head throbbed as she pushed herself off the cold floor, the familiar ache of fatigue gnawing at her. She felt like a prisoner within her own skin, her body trapped in a vessel of madness that refused to let her escape. The ship was watching her, waiting. But for what? Elena! The voice drifted into her mind again, as soft as a whisper, but this time there was something different about it. Something more intimate, more personal. It wasn't a distortion of Yulia's voice anymore, nor was it a tortured echo of Ivanov's last words. It was something else. A presence, unseen but undeniably there. Her heart skipped a beat, and her breath caught in her throat as she stood, shakily, pulling herself upright. She didn't want to look, didn't want to turn around, but her legs seemed to move on their own, carrying her toward the source of the voice. The air was thick, as if the ship itself had become heavier, more oppressive, like it was alive and breathing, exhaling in ragged, uneven gasps. The walls were slick with condensation, moisture pooling in strange patterns, as though the ship had begun to sweat. Eleanor's feet felt like they were sinking into the floor, the metal beneath her softening, pulsing, warping. The corridor ahead twisted, the light from the broken fluorescents flickering sporadically, casting erratic shadows that played tricks on her eyes. The shadows moved with a life of their own, stretching, elongating, bending and twisting into shapes that couldn't possibly exist. She tried to focus, to steady herself, but the shapes only grew more grotesque. A small sound behind her made her freeze. It was the scrape of metal against metal, soft and slow. The sound of something moving, something alive. Her eyes snapped to the door of the adjacent chamber. The door was slightly ajar. She hadn't noticed it before, but now it seemed to beckon her, a silent invitation from the darkness within. Her breath shallow. Elena hesitated only a moment before she moved toward it. There was no turning back now. Every instinct screamed for her to run, to escape this nightmare. But the ship, this thing, would not let her. It would never let her leave. The door creaked open, and the stench hit her immediately. A thick, coppery odor, metallic and rancid. She gagged, her stomach churning, but there was no turning back now. The room was empty, or so it seemed at first. The walls were slick with rust, every surface caked in some thick, tar-like substance. She could see shapes, hunched and malformed, pressed against the far wall. Her heart skipped in her chest as she realized they were people, or at least they had been people. Their faces were twisted in agony, eyes wide and unblinking, frozen in terror. Their mouths were open in silent screams, their bodies contorted in unnatural positions, like something had forced them to remain that way. Their skin had taken on a sickly pallor, stretched tight over their bones. But what chilled her to the core was the faint glow emanating from their bodies, a dull, sickly green that flickered with unnatural life. She took a hesitant step forward, unable to pull her eyes away from the bodies, her legs weak beneath her. Every instinct screamed at her to leave, to run as fast and as far as she could. But she was rooted to the spot, drawn by some unseen force. And then she heard it, a whisper. It came from the bodies, or rather, it came from the space between them, where the air itself seemed to thrum with a low, pulsing rhythm. The whisper was so faint, so quiet, that at first she thought it might be her imagination, but as it grew louder, As the ship seemed to draw a collective breath, Elena's blood ran cold. "Do you hear it?" Her eyes snapped to one of the bodies. Its mouth was wide open, and from it came the whisper. The voice wasn't human. It was something else, something old, something ancient. "We are waiting. We are always waiting. They're coming for you." Elena stumbled back, nearly falling as her heart raced in her chest. Her hand shot out to steady herself against the wall, but the surface wasn't cold, wasn't metallic as she expected. It was warm, flesh, soft, pulsing beneath her touch. She yanked her hand away with a gasp, looking down to find her fingers smeared with a black, viscous fluid. Her stomach lurched, and then, like the floodgates had opened, the whispers began to fill her mind. Thousands of voices, all speaking at once, overlapping and intertwining in a cacophony of agony and despair. It was the sound of 1,000 souls, trapped in the ship, lost to the void, never to escape. You are part of it now. They'll come for you, just like they came for us. There is no escape, no salvation. You are already dead. The voices were inside her head now, pressing against her skull, drowning out all coherent thought. She tried to scream, but the sound was caught in her throat, strangled by the weight of the words, the weight of their truth. She wasn't just trapped in the ship, she was part of it now. The ship wasn't just alive, it was hungry. Her knees buckled beneath her, and she collapsed to the ground, hands pressed to her ears in a desperate attempt to block out the sound. But the voices would not cease. They only grew louder, their words more frantic, more desperate. And then she heard something else, a sound that cut through the madness. The sound of footsteps. Slow, methodical, unwavering. They were coming. They had come for her. Chapter 9. The Hunger of the Void. And the footsteps grew louder, echoing through the narrow hallway like a drumbeat, each thud a hammer striking against her skull. Elena's breath came in shallow gasps, her heart pounding in her chest as she scrambled backward, her back hitting the wall behind her. The room had grown colder, the air thick with the metallic scent of decay, clinging to her skin, making it feel as though the ship itself was swallowing her alive. The whispers were still there, relentless, gnawing at her sanity. They crawled beneath her skin, burrowing into her mind like parasites, making her feel as though she were no longer herself, but a part of something else, something ancient, something hungry. Their voices filled her thoughts, drowning out everything else, a constant barrage of despair, anguish, and death. They know you are here. They will never stop coming for you. You cannot escape. You are already one of us. But it was the footsteps, slow, deliberate, that consumed her attention. She couldn't ignore them. She could feel them in her bones, vibrating the floor beneath her. A heavy, inevitable presence that seemed to draw closer with every breath she took. She tried to move, but her legs were weak, unresponsive, as if the very ship itself was holding her in place. The pulse of the walls, thick with that eerie, unnatural warmth, seemed to reach deep into her body, making her heart beat in sync with the ship's rhythm. Then, a voice. It was different. This voice was not like the others. It was deep and guttural, a slow rasp that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. You can't run from the hunger. Elena's eyes snapped to the doorway. She was no longer alone. The figure stood there, cloaked in shadows, its features hidden beneath the dark fabric of what looked like a tattered spacesuit. The outline was barely visible, but Elena could feel it, the weight of its presence pressing against her mind, suffocating her in a way that was both physical and psychological. It was as though the figure was made of the very darkness surrounding them, a spectre shaped from the void itself. They will find you. The voice came again, colder now, carrying a strange reverberation, as though it were bouncing off the very walls of her mind. Elena opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came. The figure took a step forward, and the floor beneath her seemed to tremble. "No," Elena whispered, shaking her head as she struggled to push herself up from the floor. "No, please. Leave me alone." The figure didn't respond. Instead, it extended one hand toward her, its fingers long and bony, wrapped in dark leather-like material, like the decayed remnants of an ancient civilization. The fingers moved with a slow, deliberate grace, and as they neared, Eleanor could see the faintest traces of movement within the suit. Shifting shadows, crawling shapes that seemed to twist and writhe beneath the surface, just out of sight. The air around her grew even colder. Her breath puffed out in front of her in misty clouds, but her body felt too heavy, as though it were no longer her own. A sudden agonizing pain shot through her chest. It was sharp, burning, like something was tearing at her from the inside. She cried out, clutching her ribs, but the pain only intensified. It felt as though her very soul were being ripped apart, disintegrating into nothingness, leaving only fragments of her once solid self. The figure was now standing directly in front of her, its hand hovering just inches from her face. There was no escape. Her mind raced, scrambling for a way out, any way to break free from this suffocating nightmare. But there was none. The ship's presence, the darkness, the hunger. It was all closing in on her. "You are not what you were," the figure spoke again, its voice now a low guttural whisper, like a thread of darkness wrapping around her. "You are becoming part of us." Eleanor's chest heaved, her pulse quickening as the pressure in her head grew unbearable. She could feel her consciousness slipping, her thoughts scattering like dust in the wind. The whispers were louder now, overlapping with the voice of the figure, filling her mind with unbearable clarity. "We are eternal. We are the void. We are the hunger that never ends." In that moment, Elena understood. She wasn't just trapped in the ship anymore. She was part of it. The hunger had taken root within her, just as it had with the others, just as it had with every soul that had wandered into this forsaken place. The ship wasn't just alive, it was a parasite, feeding off the remnants of the dead, the broken, the lost. And now, Eleanor was one of them. She was part of the ship's endless hunger, a part of something that had no beginning and no end. The figure moved closer, its hand now brushing against her cheek, and Eleanor gasped as an icy chill seeped into her skin. The cold was suffocating, an otherworldly frost that spread from the point of contact, freezing her blood, turning her veins to ice. "You belong to the void now," the voice whispered, its breath cold against her ear, "and it will never let you go." Her vision blurred, her body going numb as the ship's presence, its hunger, overtook her. She could feel the pulse of the void inside her, like a dark star flickering to life, expanding in her chest. It was a horrible, consuming emptiness, and it was all she would ever know from now on. There was no escape. There was no way out. The hunger had taken her. Chapter 10. The Last Echo. The silence that followed was deafening. The entity, the heart of the ship, had recoiled, as though stunned by the force of Elena's defiance. The whispers faded, reduced to an eerie, distant hum, like the remnants of a storm. For a long moment, there was no sound, no motion, just the suffocating cold and the oppressive weight of the void that pressed down from every direction. Eleanor's breath was ragged, her chest heaving as though she had just fought a battle, though the only thing she had fought was the darkness that had invaded her mind and soul. The pulse in her ears, the hum of the ship's malevolent life force, had weakened, but only slightly. It was still there, lingering like a shadow, threatening to reclaim her at any moment. She stood frozen in the void, her mind still struggling to piece together the shattered fragments of her thoughts. The hunger inside her had not disappeared. It still churned, a dark pit within her chest, demanding to be fed. But now, it felt different. Now, it felt tamed. Can it be controlled? The question echoed in her mind, but it was not a question she had an answer to. She had felt the entity's power, the crushing force that had bent her will, twisted her thoughts, and gnawed at her very being. Yet in that brief moment of clarity, she had pushed it away. She had pushed it away. Elena took a step forward. The cold seemed to retreat, but only just. Her footsteps echoed eerily in the empty space, each one a reminder that the vastness of the ship stretched on, endless and unknowable. But the closer she moved to the heart of the ship, the clearer the feeling became. She was not alone. There was something else here. Something new. Something that had been dormant. The lights, if they could even be called that, flickered, casting long, twisted shadows against the walls. The floor beneath her feet groaned as if the very ship were waking up, responding to her presence. She could feel the weight of its stare on her, like 1,000 eyes fixed upon her from the shadows, watching, waiting. But there was no longer a sense of hunger in those eyes, only an insatiable curiosity. Elena continued forward, her movements slow, deliberate. She had no idea what she was walking toward, but something deep inside her told her that she was nearing the heart of it all, the place where everything began and everything would ultimately end. A door appeared before her, its frame hollow and dark, carved into the very flesh of the ship. It pulsed like a living thing, the edges shuddering with each passing moment. The door was a portal into something, some deep, unfathomable space where the ship's true nature lay hidden. The whispers were louder here, more distinct. They weren't just voices now. They were words. "Join us." The voice was low, almost like a chant, repeating over and over, each syllable sending shivers down her spine. It wasn't just the ship that was alive now. It was everything. The walls, the very air she breathed. Everything around her seemed to be alive with a singular, terrifying purpose. The door groaned as if opening to reveal the abyss itself, and with every creak of its hinges, Elena's resolve weakened. But she could not stop now. She had already come too far. The hunger that had consumed her was no longer a foreign entity. It was hers now, and she was no longer afraid. Elena stepped through the door. Utamisabat Martha beyond the threshold, the ship's true heart revealed itself in all its terrifying, incomprehensible glory. It was not a simple room or chamber, but a vast expanse that defied the laws of reality. The walls seemed to twist and writhe, made of something organic and alien. Flesh, bone and metal all blending into one, a twisted amalgamation that pulsated with life. In the center of the room was the source, the heart of the ship. It was not a thing of flesh, not a creature in any traditional sense. It was a mass, a dark void, like an immense living eye that saw into the deepest recesses of her soul. It swirled with an unnatural energy, a vortex of darkness and light, pulling everything around it into its gravitational pull. Elena's pulse quickened, her heart beating in time with the ship's ominous rhythm. She could feel it, feel the ship's hunger, its endless, insatiable thirst. But it was different now. She wasn't an outsider anymore. She wasn't just a victim of its hunger. She had become one with it. She had become its vessel, its conduit. And for the first time, Elena understood what it truly wanted. It wanted more than just her soul. It wanted everything. It wanted to consume the universe, to fold the very fabric of existence into its dark embrace. She could see it now, the truth. The ship was not just a structure. It was a living entity, born of the void, an ancient force that had drifted across time and space, searching for something, for someone, for her. "You are mine, Elena." The voice rumbled, not in her ears, but in her mind, reverberating deep within her bones. "You are the key to the void, the one who will open the door to everything." Elena's eyes filled with tears, but not from fear. The tears were born of something else, something much deeper. She had become part of this thing. She had become the very thing she had once feared. The heart of the ship pulsed, the darkness in its core swirling faster, drawing closer, as though it were about to devour her whole. And for a moment, Elena hesitated. The hunger in her, the dark void that had once consumed her, now reached outward, as though it too sought to open the gate to something far worse. She was the key, and the ship, the void, would use her to shatter the boundaries of space and time. But Elena's hands, shaking with a strange sense of finality, reached for the heart. In that moment, she embraced it. She was no longer a victim. She was no longer lost. Elena had become the ship. She had become the void. And in the deepest, most terrifying part of herself, she knew what would come next. The ship's hunger would never be sated. Its journey would never end. The darkness would stretch on forever.